It was the kind of cold that silences a town. January of 1985 had rolled in with a wind sharp enough to slice through the thickest coats, carrying with it the muted scent of wood smoke from chimney. That never seemed to rest. The streets of Milford were nearly empty that Tuesday morning, a hush hanging over Main Street as though the snow itself had swallowed sound. Just after sunrise, a boy delivering newspapers was the first to notice something strange. The Milford Community Clinic, normally lit from within by the pale glow of fluorescent tubes, stood dark. Its front doors were chained shut, a heavy steel lock glinting under the frost. A sheet of paper curling at the edges from the damp air was taped to the glass, 4 words written in a hurried scrawl: no further appointments. By mid-morning, people gathered on the sidewalk, scarves wrapped high against the cold, whispering to one another. The clinic's blinds were drawn tight, no movement inside, the receptionist's car wasn't in the lot, and most unsettling of all, Dr. Elias Marrow, a man who had never once missed a day of work in 23 years, was nowhere to be seen. A phone call to his home rang unanswered. The sheriff's knock on his front door met only silence. It was as if the man, the staff, the pulse of the building itself had simply evaporated overnight. Days turned into weeks, snow came and went. Rumors flared then died down, leaving only a peculiar absence where a trusted institution had once stood. People spoke of it less and less, as though the act of remembering might invite something unwelcome back into town. And yet, for those who had once walked through those clinic doors, for the mothers whose children he'd treated, for the miners whose injuries he'd stitched, the suddenness of that winter morning was a wound that never quite healed. It would take decades before anyone dared to open those doors again. And when they did, what they found waiting in the dark was far stranger than the empty building they expected. Before the chains on the clinic doors and the whispers in the street, Dr. Elias Marrow had been as much a fixture of Milford as the old clock tower or the church bell that marked each passing hour. Tall, with a narrow frame and a slight stoop that came from years of leaning toward patience, he carried himself with a kind of understated dignity. His voice was low, steady, the kind that could calm a frightened child or ease the tension in a worried parent with just a few quiet words. He lived alone in a weathered Victorian house at the edge of town, its porch sagging slightly, the paint worn thin by decades of winters. His wife Margaret had passed in 1978, taken quickly by an illness that seemed to age him overnight. Still, he kept the flower beds she once tended, planting tulips in spring and chrysanthemums in the fall, as if the blooms could hold her memory alit. Longer, those who knew him outside the clinic said he was a man of habits. He rose before dawn, drank his coffee black, and walked the same 3 blocks to work every day, rain or shine. He carried a worn leather satchel that smelled faintly of antiseptic, its brass clasp dulled with age. On Sundays, he sat in the back pew at St. Andrew's, head bowed but eyes distant, as though his mind were often elsewhere. In the waiting room, he remembered every name, every injury, every small detail people assumed would be forgot. He once recalled, without checking a file, the exact date a miner named Frank Hollies had broken his wrist in a shaft collapse 7 years prior. When a local girl, Anna Price, fell from her bicycle, he not only patched her knee but asked about the red scarf she had worn the winter before. Yet in the months before the clinic closed, small shifts began to appear. He lingered in the X-ray room longer than usual, sometimes emerging with a frown that vanished the moment someone met his eyes. Patients noticed that he began locking his filing cabinets even between appointments. A few said they heard him speaking softly into the phone in the back office, his tone clipped, unlike his usual calm. Still, no one thought much of it at the time. After all, Elias Marrow was the man you called in the middle of the night when fever struck, the one who would drive through a snowstorm to stitch a W. And if there were burdens weighing on him, the town assumed they were simply his to carry. Looking back, those subtle changes feel heavier. A pause too long before answering a question, a glance toward the door before giving a diagnosis. The faint smell of cigarette smoke on his coat, though he had never been known to smoke. The kind of details that at the time slipped past unnoticed, but later began to form a pattern no one wanted to admit they had seen. By late autumn of 1984, the air in the Milford Clinic felt different. Patients who had been coming for years began to sense it, though few could put it into words. The waiting room, once filled with the soft hum of conversation, had grown quieter. The receptionist, Mrs. Turner, said she often found Dr. Marrow standing in the hallway between examination rooms, staring at nothing in particular, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. One afternoon, a young mother named Claire Denton brought in her son for a sprained ankle. While the boy sat on the table swinging his legs, Claire noticed the doctor pause mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the far wall, his brow furrowed. He finished the appointment quickly, almost abruptly, and as she left, she swore she heard the metallic click of a cabinet lock the moment the door closed. Behind her, other patients reported stranger moments. Mr. Lawson, a retired postal worker, came in for his yearly checkup and found the X-ray room door shut tight, a faint light glowing underneath. He waited in the hallway for nearly 20 minutes before the doctor emerged, startled to see him there. When asked if there had been an emergency, Marrow gave a thin smile and said, "Just following up on something," before ushering him into another room. Then there was the matter of the ledger. In early December, Mrs. Turner noticed that certain appointment slots were being blocked out in the schedule, marked only with a dash, no patient name, no notes. When she asked, he told her they were special consults and not to be concerned. She never saw anyone arrive for those times, but she did hear the back door open and close on more than one occasion. The most unsettling account came from a teenager named Robbie Hale, who had been delivering medical supplies for the local pharmacy. He said that during one delivery, he caught a glimpse of an X-ray film left on a lightbox in the back room. It didn't look like a normal image, at least not to him. The bones seemed oddly shaped, with a faint glint of something metallic inside the chest cavity. Before he could take a closer look, the doctor appeared and switched off the light, telling him to leave the box by the door. These small incidents, scattered across weeks, might have meant nothing on their own. But together they painted a picture of a man growing secretive, protective of certain parts of his work. There was a tension in his movements, as though he were trying to guard something invisible yet fragile. No one in town knew what that something was, only that it seemed to be pulling him further and further away from the man they thought they knew. And in hindsight, it was the kind of tension that feels like the air before a storm. The day it happened was colder than most, January 14, 1985. A Monday. The kind of morning where the snow didn't just sit on the ground, it clung to the air, hanging in faint flurries that caught in your eyelashes. The sun was slow to rise, casting only a weak gray light across Main Street. At 7:45 a.m. Mrs. Turner arrived for work, stamping the snow from her boots, expecting to see the familiar glow through the clinic's front windows. Instead, she stopped dead on the sidewalk, heavy chains wound through the handles of the double glass doors, a solid steel lock hanging at the center. Behind the glass, the blinds were drawn tight. Her reflection stared back at her in the cold pane. She tried the back entrance, fumbling with her keys, but the lock resisted. That was when she noticed the paper, taped at an angle to the inside of the front door. 4 words hurriedly written in black marker, "No further appointments." The handwriting was unmistakably Dr. Marrow's by 8:10 a.m. Patients had begun to gather, stamping their feet against the cold. A man named Joe Carpenter, who had driven in from his farm for a follow-up on a back injury, peered through a narrow gap in the blinds. He saw only darkness inside, no lights, no movement. The faint hum of the old vending machine in the waiting room was gone. Someone suggested checking the doctor's house. Sheriff Langley, a broad-shouldered man with a slow way of speaking, drove over immediately. 10 minutes later, he returned with a strange report. The doctor's car was still in the garage, coated with a thin frost. The keys hung neatly from a hook on the wall. The kitchen table had a coffee cup sitting on it, half drunk, a thin skin of cold cream floating on top. There were no signs of struggle, no suitcase missing, no note. By late morning, the building stood silent while the small crowd outside shifted from confusion to unease. The clinic's phone rang endlessly when people tried calling in, the sound muffled through the glass. One by one, patients left, pulling their collars high against the wind, glancing back over their shoulders. That night, a light snow fell again, dusting the chains on the clinic door until they looked almost ornamental. Inside, the air remained still. And somewhere between that final locked turn of the key and the next sunrise, Dr. Elias Marrow had vanished, taking with him whatever secrets were locked inside those walls. The search began before the snow had melted from that morning's fall. By noon on the day the clinic was found locked, Sheriff Langley had called in 2 deputies and a volunteer search party. They started with the obvious, checking Dr. Marrow's home again, this time more thoroughly. Every drawer, every closet, every inch of the basement was examined. Nothing. His bed was made, the sheets smooth and cold. His winter coat hung by the door, his boots lined neatly beneath it. The absence of disruption was almost more unsettling than if they had found signs of a struggle. The next step was to trace his known movements. Neighbors reported last seeing him the previous Saturday evening, walking back from the grocery store with a brown paper bag under his arm. Inside that bag, according to the store clerk, were only bread, milk, and a tin of coffee. No one recalled seeing him after that. The sheriff had deputies comb the streets between the clinic and his home, poking through alleyways, dumpsters, and even the shallow banks of the Froz. In Milford Creek, by the second day they expanded the search beyond town. Volunteers on snowmobiles covered the open fields and wooded edges, while the county search and rescue team sent 2 dogs trained to track human scent. The dogs picked up a faint trail near the back of the clinic but lost it within 20 yards, as if it had been erased. The building itself posed its own challenge. Without a warrant, they could only inspect the exterior, but the sheriff managed to convince the town council to grant access for public safety. Inside, the air was cold and stale, the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to the walls. Files still sat in the reception area. Medical instruments lay neatly in place. It was as if everyone had simply stepped out for lunch and never returned. The search stirred rumors almost immediately. Some whispered that he had been taken, abducted in the middle of the night. Others said he might have walked away on his own, abandoning the town without warning. A few, mostly older residents, lowered their voices to suggest something darker, that the doctor had been hiding something, and that whatever it was had finally caught up with him. Local papers ran the story for a week straight, splashing headlines across their front pages. Respected town doctor missing, clinic closed without explanation, but beyond the words and photographs there was little to report. Every theory ended the same way, in silence. By the end of the first week, the search radius had been extended to neighboring counties, with flyers pinned to post office boards and taped inside inner windows. The sheriff promised to pursue every lead, but privately many in the search party admitted the trail had already gone cold. Milford was a small town. You couldn't just disappear here, not unless you had help or a place to hide that no one had thought to look. Weeks passed, and with them came the slow, grinding weight of frustration. The sheriff's office, once bustling with volunteers and tip-offs, began to feel quieter. The stack of leads on Langley's desk grew thinner, not from progress but from discarding one dead end after another. The first false lead came from a trucker passing through from Ohio, who swore he had given a ride to a man matching Marrow's description 2 nights after the clinic closed. He described him as wearing a dark coat and carrying a satchel. But when investigators tracked the route and reviewed motel registries along the way, nothing matched, not a single signature. Not a single witness to confirm the man existed. Another tip pointed to a remote cabin 20 miles north, where smoke had been seen curling from the chimney. Deputies trudged through waist-deep snow to find it abandoned, the ashes in the fireplace cold and weeks old. Inside, only a cot and a rusted kettle remained, no signs of recent life. Meanwhile, the town itself began to shift under the weight of the unanswered. Some people stopped speaking about him altogether, as though the very name Elias Marrow carried bad luck. Others kept his memory alive but with an edge of suspicion now, wondering aloud if perhaps the doctor they'd trusted had been living a life none of th. M truly knew for Mrs. Turner. The hardest blow came when the sheriff returned the clinic keys to the council and announced that without new evidence, the investigation LDB scaled back. She had worked beside Marrow for nearly 20 years and now she sat in her small kitchen each night, staring at the keys she had kept on her own keys to a place that no longer felt like part of her life. Theories began to drift further into the strange. Someone claimed to have heard from a cousin in Fairhaven that the doctor had been seen boarding a ferry under a different name. Another swore he'd been spotted in a diner across state lines, wearing glasses and growing a beard. Every rumor sparked hope, only to collapse under the same problem: no proof, no trace, no trail. By spring, the clinic had become an empty shell, its windows clouded with dust. A few children dared each other to peek inside, claiming to see shadows moving in the X-ray room, though the sheriff dismissed it as nonsense. Still, the image stuck with people, a flicker of something in a place meant to be lifeless. And so the search, once urgent and relentless, dwindled to occasional phone calls and file updates. The town returned to its routines, but not without a quiet, lingering tension. It was the kind of unease that made people double-lock their doors at night and glance a little longer at the clinic whenever they passed. As though somewhere beneath the silence, a truth was waiting and refusing to be found. When the morning came, it brought with it a strange stillness, the kind that makes you feel as though the whole world is holding its breath. I woke to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking clock above the mantel, and the low creak of the floorboards as I crossed the room. Outside, a pale mist hung over the street, softening the edges of everything it touched. For a while, I just stood there by the window, my coffee cooling in my hands, watching the shapes of passers-by dissolve into the fog. Around mid-morning, I decided to walk down to the harbor. The air carried the briny scent of the sea, mixed with the faint aroma of fresh bread drifting from the bakery at the corner. Boats bobbed gently against their moorings, their masts drawing thin lines into the sky. It was there, near the weathered bench by the docks, that I spotted Harold. He was leaning against the railing, his hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon as though waiting for something only he could see. When he noticed me, he smiled faintly, but his expression carried a weight I couldn't ignore. We didn't speak right away. Instead, I stood beside him, following his gaze over the water. The gulls cried overhead, their calls echoing against the warehouses, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled from a ship. Finally, he exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "I think they've been here," he said quietly, almost as if talking to himself. I wanted to ask who, but the way his eyes tightened told me he wasn't ready to explain. So we walked along the dock in silence, each step in sync, the boards beneath us groaning under our weight. He stopped abruptly near a stack of fishing nets, crouched down, and picked up a small object wrapped in oilcloth. When he unwrapped it, I saw a brass key, tarnished with age, its bow engraved with a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. "That wasn't here yesterday," he murmured, turning it over in his hand. "Someone left it for me." His voice carried a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. I reached for the key, and as my fingers brushed the metal, a chill ran through me, not from the cold but from the feeling that whatever it opened was never meant to be found. Harold slipped it into his pocket without another word, and we began walking back toward the town, our footsteps echoing in the empty morning. By the time we reached the corner where our paths split, the mist had begun to lift, revealing more of the street, the storefronts, and the people emerging from their homes. Harold glanced over his shoulder before disappearing down a side alley, leaving me with the lingering sense that I'd just stepped into the first page of a story I didn't yet understand. I stood there for a long moment, holding onto the image of that key in my mind, knowing that it would come back to me sooner or later, whether I was ready A die or not, by the time I reached the narrow road leading out of town, the rain had turned from a drizzle to a steady downpour. The wipers beat back and forth in a frantic rhythm, struggling to keep up with the water blurring my view. I should have turned back. I should have waited for clearer weather. But something in me was restless, pulling me forward, as though the answer I needed was waiting beyond the curve of that road. The headlights caught the outline of a figure ahead. At first I thought it was a trick of the rain, but as I drew closer I could see it was a man standing near the ditch, drenched to the bone. He didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there watching my car approach. My pulse quickened. I slowed to a crawl, debating whether to stop. When I finally did, he leaned down to the passenger window. His face was pale, his hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wide and unfocused. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, voice shaking. "They're looking." I opened my mouth to ask who he meant, but he was already glancing over his shoulder, scanning the tree line as if something might emerge at any moment. The rain drummed on the roof. "Get in," I told him, though every part of me screamed that I might regret it. He hesitated, then slid into the seat, water pooling beneath him. As I pulled back onto the road, he kept stealing glances at the rearview mirror. "Did you see it?" he asked after a moment, his voice almost a whisper. By the old freight yard there was a light moving against the wind. I told him no, but the way he stared at me made me feel as if I should have. We drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine and the hiss of the rain filling the space between us. Then without warning he pressed his hand flat against the dashboard. "Stop here," I did, easing the car to the shoulder. He pointed toward a break in the trees. Through the rain I could make out faint shapes, rows of old wooden crates stacked haphazardly, some split open, their contents spilling into the mud. My first thought was that it looked like a shipment left to rot, but there was something else, something wrong. The wood was charred at the edges as if it had been burned, and strange markings were scrawled along the sides in a language I didn't recognize. The man's breathing quickened. "They'll come back for it," he said. "They always do." Lightning flashed, illuminating the clearing for just a second. In that instant I saw something, or maybe someone, moving among the crates, too still to be human, too deliberate to be an animal. When the darkness closed in again, the space was empty. The man beside me whispered, "Now you understand," and I realized I didn't, but I was about to. The following weeks passed in a strange rhythm, each day marked by small moments that seemed to carry more weight than they should. I would see Daniel in the hallway, sometimes in the break room, and every time our eyes met, there was an unspoken conversation neither of us dared to voice. One afternoon, as rain streaked the windows of the office, he stopped by my desk with a file in hand. His voice was calm, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, as though he'd been waiting for the right moment to speak. "Can we talk after work?" he asked quietly, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. I agreed without hesitation, even though my heart thudded in my chest. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air and the low hum of conversation made everything feel oddly private. He didn't sit right away, instead standing there for a moment as if gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, it wasn't what I expected. He told me about a decision he had been struggling with, something that could change the course of his life, and, in some way, mine too. His words were careful, deliberate, and yet tinged with a kind of urgency that made it impossible to look away. I found myself leaning forward, listening not just to his words but to the pauses in between. As the rain outside turned into a steady downpour, the cafe seemed to shrink around us, the rest of the world fading into the background. I realized then that this wasn't just about work or friendship, and maybe it never had been. There was a connection, fragile but undeniable, that had been building quietly beneath the surface. He reached for his cup but hesitated halfway, his gaze locked on mine, and in that silence I knew something was shifting between us. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid to find out. When I stepped outside that evening, the rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened under the dim glow of the street lamps. Daniel walked beside me, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, our footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. For a while we didn't speak. It wasn't an awkward silence, more like the quiet after a storm when the air feels softer and every sound is sharper. I could hear the distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the faint hum of a neon sign flickering in the distance. At the corner, we paused under the awning of a closed bookstore. Daniel looked at me and there was a flicker in his eyes, part hesitation, part determination. He said he didn't want to keep wondering what if. That life was too short to leave certain things unsaid. His voice trembled just enough for me to notice, though he tried to mask it with a half-smile. I felt my own breath catch, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag. The truth was, I'd been carrying the same thoughts, though I'd convinced myself they were safer locked away. But in that moment, standing there with the cool night air brushing my face, I realized how exhausting it had been to keep them hidden. I told him quietly that I didn't want to wonder either, that whatever this was, friendship, something more, I wanted to see where it led. His shoulders eased, as if he'd been holding them tense for weeks. We didn't touch, not yet, but the distance between us felt smaller than it had ever been. He offered to walk me home, and I let him, even though it meant taking the long way. Each step felt deliberate, as though we both knew the night was marking the start of something neither of us could fully name, but both were willing to. Looking back now, I realized that night wasn't just another quiet walk home, it was the first page of a new chapter. The kind you don't plan for, but somehow know will stay with you. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it, and sometimes the smallest choices can lead to the most meaningful turns. If you've ever felt that pull toward someone or something, don't ignore it. Moments like these don't wait forever, and neither should you. Take the step, say the words, let yourself find out where the path might lead. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. And if you want to hear more stories like this, moments of quiet courage, unexpected connections, and the ways life changes in a heartbeat, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and join me for the next one. You never know, the next story might just be yours.